First speaker is on, so I wanted to welcome everyone. I know we're at over 70 people signed on now, and that's probably going to continue to increase. I think we have around 170 registered if we get everyone to sign on here this afternoon, which is fantastic. So welcome. We got a good program, and I will just go ahead and hand it over to Scott for the introductions for everyone.
Thanks, Chris. And so today we're going to start out with Nancy, then move over to John, and then we'll have a Q&A session with Matt and Ari. So as we kind of queue up Nancy's presentation, I'll just quickly announce her. We are very fortunate to have Nancy Rawson here. She's the Associate Director and Vice President at Monell Chemical Center. And today she'll be presenting on the taste and smell loss in the post-COVID era and the challenging face of flavor perception. So I know I'm very interested to hear this. And when I had my conversation with her, it's a very dynamic space. So it's constantly changing. So it's going to be very interesting to hear from her. So thank you very much, Nancy.
Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and bring this content to you today. As Scott said, I've been combing through the reports and the data right up until 5 minutes before the presentation because it's such a rapidly evolving set of pile of data. I would speculate that nearly everyone on the call today. I think if you could mute yourself if you're not speaking, it would be helpful. I'm getting some feedback. Has probably either experienced themselves COVID-related smell loss or known someone who has. And at Monell, we've been studying taste and smell for over 50 years, and we've been in the middle of this really firestorm of problems and challenges and data in this area. So what I'm going to do today is take you through a number of areas that really were triggered by people just crying out for help. And we were hearing things like, I'm worried about getting vitamins because fruits and vegetables don't taste good. I can't taste anything. It just feels like something I have to do. Things taste and smell like they were forgotten in the fridge. It didn't smell right. It didn't taste right. It was just awful. Fruit smells to me like NyQuil. So these are things that were just hitting people, and really they didn't know where to go. They weren't getting much help from their primary care physicians, who often don't know much about these conditions in any event, and there's not that much that can be done. So, now we're 2 years in, right? And we have a lot of data. We need more data, but the main points that I'll be going through with you today are that we've learned that this virus devastates the olfactory epithelium and taste buds. This is particularly true for the alpha and delta variants, where 70 and perhaps even as high as 90% of people experience some degree of smell and or taste loss. It's a bit less so for Omicron, and this data is really just coming out. There's a couple of papers that are very recent that are reporting somewhere on the order of 30 to 40%. The sensory deficits are sudden. They often hit all 3 sensory modalities. And we do know that objective measures, when you actually test people with test stimuli, you get a higher prevalence than subjective measures where you just ask people, how do you think your taste and smell are today? Fortunately, recovery does occur in most cases. These systems are incredibly good at regenerating, fortunately. But there's a large variation in the time course and the degree of recovery. There's often interruptions, so people will be recovering, and then it seems like they're not changing for a while, or they get Perasmia or some other dysfunction. And now we've gotten pretty solid data that at least 10 to 15% of those people will have long-term deficits in perception. The other point that is becoming more important to study is that there's additional risk factors for taste and smell loss, such as aging and obesity. And when these additional factors are superimposed on a history of smell loss from COVID, this is going to potentiate the effect and increase the risk of more deficits later on in life. So that's kind of the main point of my talk. If you don't want to listen to the details, you can take a break or do something else. But as flavor chemists, you all know that flavor includes taste, smell, and chemisthesis, these chemical senses. And these, it turns out now that all three of these senses can be affected by the COVID virus. Before COVID, smell loss was a fairly common, well-known effect of upper respiratory viral diseases and chronic respiratory diseases. But before COVID, the incidence of true taste loss or true insensitivity to things like capsaicin was extraordinarily rare. We had a clinic at Jefferson for over 10 years, and the number of people that came in with true taste loss, I could count on the fingers of two hands. It just, other than people who are going through radiation, oral radiation, or chemotherapy, things like that. So when people started talking about taste loss, we didn't really believe it, actually, because it's just so rare. And then, everybody's heard about the guy on video, YouTube or whatever, where he was just like eating hot peppers and was like, yeah, there's nothing there, can't get it. So that's hard to fake, but it, and fortunately it's not as common as taste or smell loss, but it definitely is a consequence. So to take us through and to understand a little bit more about what's happening physiologically, because I think that will also help you as flavor chemists to think about how best to approach your projects and your problem solving. If we go in the nose, we have the olfactory epithelium, and the epithelium has these different types of cells. There's mature neurons, there's supporting cells, there's stem cells, and there's these little microvillar cells that are pretty interesting, and they may play a part that we're just starting to understand. And then we have these nerve endings that are trigeminal nerve endings. When COVID comes along, what we learned is that these supporting cells that play a very important role in structural support, detoxification of incoming odors, and defense get attacked. The olfactory neurons themselves that detect odors actually do not have the receptors that the COVID virus binds to. So they're not directly attacked by the virus. But what happens when COVID does come in is that it's taken up very rapidly into these supporting cells, and it takes away the structural support that the olfactory epithelium needs to maintain its integrity. And so as these cells collapse, if you think about it as your computer keyboard, you end up with this. And so it's easy to kind of imagine why that's not going to communicate an odor all that well, any better than it would communicate a word to your computer hardware. What we've also learned recently, though, is that in addition to this structural integrity problem, there's changes in the genes that are expressed by the olfactory neurons. And so there's also, and we don't know if this is somehow direct, even though the virus isn't getting into the cell, or if it's a result of the effects the virus is having on the supporting cells. But what it's doing is preventing the receptor neurons from actually expressing odor receptors. So if the receptor neurons, even though they look normal anatomically, if they're not able to produce the proteins that detect odors, you're not going to be detecting odors. So that's another problem. So the data show, again, that all three senses were being affected. And this is based on over 4,000 respondents with COVID-19, based either on clinical assessment or a lab test. And this is self-report, but it is pretty clear here that people before COVID are reporting their smell and taste as very good, on a scale of 0 to 100. And then during COVID, they're reporting it as pretty bad, and certainly a clearly distinguishable difference here. You can see that there is a lot of variation. So there's individuals that didn't have a good sense of smell before COVID. And then after, it probably didn't get better, right? So this is sort of the first data set that really showed us that all three senses were likely to be affected, and that these are dramatic changes. But that was self-report data. And so then as we started to be able to get tests out and get people into clinics and do different types of remote testing where people were actually being sent kits for smell testing or taste testing, we discovered that the better we measured smell, the more smell loss was being detected. And so this is an initial study where people were directly measured in 28 different studies, over 3,000 people, and the percent frequency of smell loss was about 70%. Whereas in other studies where only self-report was used, it's closer to 47 to 50%. More recently still, in a study where they used more comprehensive smell testing, they reported 86% of mild cases experienced some degree of smell loss. So this is really, if you test carefully enough, even if the individual isn't noticing the smell difference, there can be deficits that occur that can be picked up with more sophisticated types of smell tests like detection thresholds or more complex odor identification tests. And so what about taste? So as I said, before COVID, taste loss was really very unusual. And people with smell loss often incorrectly report taste loss because, unlike the group of people I'm speaking to today, many people that I speak to don't know the difference between taste and smell. And so they tend to lump it together because they are so closely related. But it turns out that COVID-19 is different. And when you do objective measures, the proportion of people with true taste loss is not that different between objective measures and when you're actually doing a taste test. It's around 40 to 50% typically. Here's another a little more recent meta-analysis of 59 studies that found about 59% with taste loss. However, a recent study suggests that nearly 89% of patients may have some degree of taste loss. So again, the reason these numbers are varying, and this is an important thing to understand about the field of taste and smell, is that there's a lot of different instruments for measuring sensitivity and ability to perceive taste and smell. You have odor identification, you have sensitivity, detection thresholds, recognition thresholds, identification. discrimination. So the more sophisticated we do the tests, it seems like the more differences we're picking up, and the more, sometimes more subtle differences, perhaps with differences between different types of stimuli. So if one study maybe only used 1 or 2 stimuli and another one uses a larger battery, they might see quite different frequencies. So these data are, they're sometimes I feel like I'm in front of a fire hose of data because it's just coming at us from so many different directions, and it'll settle out, and we'll get sorted out, and we'll get a better picture. But I'm relaying the different perspectives from different studies. So it's the truth is in here somewhere, but it's a large number regardless. So there's also been some studies looking at risk factors, because obviously, even if it's 40% or 50%, that's still a lot of people that get COVID that don't have taste or smell loss. And what we're seeing is that the prevalence of effects, sensory effects, chemosensory effects, seems to be higher among females. Having a history of smoking or current smoking elevates the risk of smell dysfunction. And respiratory allergy history elevates the risk of smell and taste dysfunction. So these are pretty reasonable risk factors to expect. And with respect to the gender difference, that I think warrants further study, because we don't necessarily understand that. Generally, females do better on odor identification tests to begin with, and that may be an experiential factor, or it may be a hormonal factor. And even with this data, a lot of it is based on self-report. So this may kind of shift as we get more hard experience, directly objective data. So I think one of the really important questions for us and for you as you go through your day-to-day work, the people that had smell loss, many of them do recover. And is this just sort of a temporary issue that you need to look at acutely with maybe products that are targeting people that are sick or recently sick, or is it something that is going to continue into the future? And how is that going to impact your populations that you're designing flavors for? And this also, the data is rapidly evolving. So this was a fairly large study. Again, this was self-report, but they found that about 10% of people with COVID-19 smell and taste loss have not recovered or even have gotten worse after 6 months. That was in 2020. A 2021 study found that 16% of people had not recovered or had gotten worse after 1 year. 22% reported improvement, although they still felt that their sensitivity was less than it had been before COVID. And in one of the studies that used actual testing, 9%, about 9% of confirmed COVID-19 patients continued to perform below normal on odor identification up to 7 months post-infection. And this is kind of interesting because they actually did multiple tests. And often when you do multiple tests, people actually get better. But in this case, that didn't happen. And many people, about 9% got worse actually. And they noted that performance was worse for lemon and soap odors. So they could kind of look at differences in different types of odors. I think there's a lot more studies that are needed in this area, because I think there is the possibility that different types of odors may recover differentially in the population, because we know that there are differences in where within the nose an odor, the receptors are for different odors. And that's related both to the size of the molecule, the lipophilicity of the molecule, and it's possible that different regions of the nose are able to recover more effectively. And this may also relate to the regions that are most at risk of being kind of hit with problems before the COVID situation. So when we looked at all the numbers and we did a meta-analysis, the estimates from the experts right now are looking like we're predicting somewhere between 4 and 5 million Americans will have long-term smell loss due to COVID-19. And this is going to not be complete anosmia, but including reduced sensitivity to odors. And we do know that this type of sensory deficit has a negative impact on eating and flavor perception. This was a study that was looking at text from Facebook. There's over 50 Facebook sites for people with taste or smell dysfunction looking for support. And so this study did text analysis of the reports of the text on one of these sites. And people report that loss of smell and flavor changes had a major impact on appetite, enjoyment, fullness, satiety. Food becomes bland and unappetizing, resulting in a reduced desire to eat, cook, or participate in food-related activities. And it really is kind of very disheartening when you talk to these people and they're sometimes just at their wits' end because they really don't feel like there's much that can, much hope for them, and they don't, the medical community doesn't have much tangible therapeutic opportunities for them. They can try anti-inflammatories or, some things that are used to treat allergies and so forth, but there's really very little that that has been shown to have real clear benefit. And I will talk a little bit about smell training a little bit later. So this is some nice data from looking at the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which found that smell dysfunction is a significant predictor of consumption of a higher energy density of foods, a higher percent of energy from total and saturated fat, more energy from added sugar. And these effects were more evident in people over 65. And there was also less dietary diversity among males 65 and over. So this is epidemiological data. It's not longitudinal data or experimental, but this was a nice study that was done and controlled for a lot of the other factors that we know influence these things, like age, sex, income, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the complications with recovery that has been particularly problematic is this development of parosmia and phantosmia. So what does that mean? So parosmia is a condition where a particular odor, say coffee, say you go to drink your morning coffee, and instead of smelling like coffee, you get dirty garbage smell. Anatosmia is when there's no odor present, but you're perceiving something that isn't present. And that's a little bit less common, but we are still seeing it. And these conditions have an even more devastating effects on food and eating. People report pervasive off smells or a metallic taste. All food tastes and smells just too disgusting to eat. Only yogurt is okay, so I lose weight instead of gaining it. Everything tastes awful for me, so you are not alone. Makes me not want to eat. And this is something that we've seen in patients with chemotherapy, where they get these metallic tastes and they lose their sense of taste, where the brain really doesn't recognize that what you're putting in your mouth is food. And there's a very strong gatekeeper role for taste in this regard, that if it doesn't fall within the sensory characteristics of food, your brain does not let you swallow it. And it's telling you with all of the strengths it can muster, do not eat this because it might kill you. So this is almost worse in terms of quality of life and health than not having a sense of smell. So what's happening here? Well, if we go back to my analogy of the computer, and this is your olfactory receptor neurons here in a pile from COVID, and you come along and you have an orange, you can easily see why there's no orange message getting to the brain here. You're just not getting anything. So that's anosmia. If you're starting to regenerate some of the receptors, but they haven't all connected yet, and they haven't all gotten back into place yet, you might have something that looks sort of like this. You've got an R, an A, a G, and they're kind of hooked up right, but the rest of it is still sort of trying to figure, not there yet. The brain might see that RAG and say, aha, that's an oily rag. That's what that is. I know that smell. And so your orange might end up smelling like an oily rag, because the quality of odors is determined by the pattern of signals that the brain gets. And so that's Perasmia. And this has been seen before as people are recovering from injuries from surgery to the nerves of the olfactory nerves. But it's typically, as I said before COVID, it was pretty rare. And this is sort of how we imagine this happening, as well as just as these nerve cells are growing back and getting reconnected to the brain, they may not be going to quite the right spot, and they may need to get kind of reconfigured a little bit. So the brain needs to relearn those patterns and reassociate them with the correct perception. And so that's why smell training is kind of an interactive approach, because one of the things that we know that smell training or any kind of training can do is strengthen the neural connections that between the associations, between the input, the stimulus, and the appropriate memory or perception. And so if someone is using smell training and going through and looking at the orange and trying to remember what it should smell like as they're going through these different odors, it probably is just helping the brain to strengthen the correct connections and forget about the incorrect connections. So that's, I would say, our current hypothesis. We don't have a good way for sure of testing this in animal models. A mouse, there have been some studies done to suggest that Perasmia is occurring in animal models. It's a little bit complex to establish that the mouse that thought that is smelling an oily rag instead of an orange, but it's not impossible. But I would say there's some neurological evidence for this, but it's not conclusive yet. So if we look at Perasmia and what is the, the sort of the sequelae or the timeline for that, in this study, they looked at 1,468 people with COVID-related smell dysfunction. Of those, about 90% had smell loss and 10% had Perasmia at their initial time point that they were being studied. They let 200 days go by and then looked at them again. And there was about 42% who had recovered from smell loss, and a higher proportion of the people who only had smell loss to begin with had recovered. So if you do get Perasmia early in the process, it may actually take a little bit longer for recovery. But another 57.7% had persistent smell dysfunction still after 200 days. And about 63.5% of those were the Perasmic cohort. So this is kind of some data that we're looking at. The notion that Perasmia is on the path to recovery is supported by some data, but it's also not supported by other data. So I think that there's certain cases, like with these people, that if they get Perasmia early on, it may mean that the virus has had some type of a neurological effect that may be affecting the central nervous system part of the process. And that may take longer to recover. So looking at the demographics, again, it's sometimes helpful to know, if there's a particular population subgroup that this is a special problem for. Across the age range, we see Perasmia is the most frequently reported in the younger age groups, whereas Phantasmia is a little bit higher reported in the middle age group. And then anosmia or hyposmia is most frequent in the older age group. And this is certainly consistent with the notion that with multiple risk factors, you're more likely to have smell loss. And again, with respect to gender, females were more likely to report Perasmia than were males, and Phantasmia was about similar. And there are some common triggers for the Perasmia experiences, these unpleasant odors. And this is some nice work that was done based on a sort of a word cloud based on prevalence and reported patient experiences. Again, text analysis. Sarah Parker, Jane Parker in England is doing some nice work as well, which is looking at more analytical chemistry and kind of separating out specific chemical compounds to look at things that are maybe particularly problematic. But generally, coffee, garlic, onion, meat odors, these are some of the most common triggers for unpleasant odors in Perasmia. Food odors, a lot of cooking food odors we see. Toothpaste, sometimes, people can't brush their teeth, or they can't use their, because mint is in here, they can't use their shampoo. It's very, very disturbing. Usually a pleasant smell is perceived as an unpleasant one. But there are instances where people report a previously unpleasant odor as being more pleasant. So one of the thoughts is that, when confronted by a confusing stimulus that the brain isn't quite sure what to make out of, it will pick the potentially dangerous thing because that's going to be more likely to keep you alive. That's kind of the hypothesis based on survival instincts, right? But it may also be that it's as much related to where in the nose different types of odors are perceived and how the process for regeneration progresses, may progress differently for different classes of odors. One of the problems is that there's no validated method to measure or detect parosmia. Right now, we just ask people, what does it, smell like? We've just recently completed a study that will be getting published fairly soon, validating a test method for parosmia. So look for that coming out very soon. So the next section, what I want to talk about a little bit too, is this notion that that impaired smell and taste, really, we're looking at it as a pandemic that may outlast the virus and its variants and have long-term effects on nutrition and human health. And the reason for that is that there's several additional factors that play into this. And one of them is age. And for the first time in US history, older adults are projected to outnumber children by 2034. And you can see this, percent of adults over 65, more and more people are living to 100. We are an aging society in the US. And as you saw from the earlier data, hyposmia and anosmia were more frequent in the older populations already. And we know that pre-COVID, smell loss occurs with age. And if we look at measured dysfunction here, this is from Haynes data, National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey data. There's a big increase here from 70 years on in the percent of the population with smell loss. And this is measured smell loss with an odor identification test, as 25% going up to 40% in the 80 and over. And I would say when we measure people 90 and over, and the next study will definitely have enough people in that group to show here, it's going to be up here somewhere. It's probably going to be 60 to 70%. And then this, what's shown here is kind of interesting because this is sort of the 60 to 69-year-old group in the middle. This is when people are most likely to report a smell problem. So this is when our sense of smell is changing. And that's the age range where people are going to start noticing it. Before that, it is changing a little, it's changing to some degree. After that, it's still getting worse, but this is where the big jump is that people notice. So when you add the COVID predictions to these bars, this is what that's going to look like in terms of increasing the percent of people, just even if it's only additive. And that's an assumption which is probably wrong, because it's probably not additive. It's probably more like having had COVID vastly increases your likelihood of age-related smell loss. What about taste loss? So we know that taste is preserved a bit better than smell with age, but there is a reduction in sensitivity with age for all taste modalities. And I would say sour and sweet sensitivity decline a little bit sooner. You know, if you can see, there's bigger changes here and here. Whereas for bitter and umami is a little bit more gradual, but for bitter and it's a little bit later. So if that wasn't enough, we also worry about obesity, and obesity rates continue to trend up in the US. And this is 2018, it's higher, it's even higher now. 42% of US adults were obese based on height and weight survey. And we know that with diet-induced obesity in mice, there's fewer taste buds, fewer taste cells per bud, and less stem cell proliferation. So the taste system, which also is very good at regenerating because it has stem cells within the taste bud, that regeneration ability is impaired in obesity. We know that, and this is even true in humans, taste bud number declines with increasing body weight in young adults, and elevated insulin particularly reduces the number of sweet sensitive taste cells. So we're shifting our taste system's ability to regenerate, and we're shifting the relative capabilities of our taste system for different taste modalities with obesity. So factors altering taste, you know, COVID-19, we don't know as much about the mechanism for taste loss with COVID-19. We do know that it can directly attack cells in the taste bud. There are type 2 cells that express the ACE2 receptor that COVID binds to. And there's taste stem cells also that express the receptor. So it's directly attacking those, the first relay, the first receptor cells for taste. With aging, there's less salivation, poor dental health, medications, and a slower rate of taste cell replacement. And with obesity, we see fewer taste buds, fewer taste cells per bud, and these effects are most prominent for the type 2 sweet sensitive cells. So it's not uniform across taste modalities. And one of the underlying factors under these things really is inflammation. All of these things trigger inflammation, and all of these things alter the taste system and the smell system's ability to regenerate. And they do that largely by virtue of the inflammatory consequences. And there's a lot of research going on right now at Monell and elsewhere to better understand how to harness the good aspects of inflammation to help promote regeneration, and how to control the aspects of inflammation that are impairing the regeneration. But what we do know is that the regenerative ability of taste and smell systems will diminish, and that as a result of, now you have all of these people, even the people that recovered their sensitivity from their senses of smell and taste after COVID, but the number of times, you know, that those systems can regenerate and their ability to regenerate is going to be diminished. So the incidence is likely to escalate going forward of taste and smell dysfunction. And we know that, you know, patients with smell loss enjoy food less. Poor sensitivity to sweet tends to lower preference and acceptance of bitter compounds. And, you know, although if you do have less sensitivity to bitter, maybe you would be more open to increasing vegetable intake. So I think, you know, there's still a lot of push and pull here that we don't know what's going to win, and we don't know which is dominant. But the long-term effects on dietary habits and nutritional health, really, I'm calling an experiment in progress, because this is the likelihood of no effect is not likely at all. There will be effects. So what we need is, we need data. Fortunately, there are large-scale data collection efforts, and if you're not familiar with this group, you might want to check them out. The Global Consortium for Chemosensory Research came together as a result of COVID, and it's allowing us to now collect data globally in a way that was never possible before. So this is one of the sort of silver lining aspects of COVID, that we've learned how to work around the world to pull data together in teams and to share data in ways that had never been done before. And it's really, really accelerating our discoveries and our understanding. So what I'd like to kind of finish up with is sort of asking you, why hasn't your doctor ever offered you a smell test? And you know, we get eye tests, we get ear tests, but we've never gotten a smell test. And if we'd had data like this, we would have known instantly that COVID was causing smell loss. Instead, it took months to collect the data to know whether it was even real or not and try to understand it. We know that loss of smell, in addition to signaling, you know, potential consequences for diet, can also be a signal for Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. So Monell is working with patient associations, World Taste and Smell Day, academic partners around the world to try to change this. We would like everybody who you know, sees their doctor once a year to get a smell test. And we'd be happy for the Society of Flavor Chemists to join in too. These are some of the groups that we're working with. This is the North American, the Smell and Taste Association of North America. They are the newest patient advocacy group. So some take-home points. The chemosensory world of people is changing on a larger scale than ever before because of COVID. Effects are evident for all three chemical senses. The recovery path and prognosis is uncertain for as many as 10 to 15%, I would say. And I would say for the other, you know, 85% that recover, they're going to be at greater risk of loss from other causes like aging, obesity, other types of follow-up infections or other types of infections or exposures. You know, I didn't mention chemesthesis in the data because really nobody's looked at chemesthetic sensitivity longitudinally. I think that's something that really does need to be done because sensitivity to pain is important. Some take-home points. Again, the effect is likely to be compounded by age, weight gain, other diseases. The protective response is likely to intensify the drive for sugar because it's not affecting all of the taste cells uniformly. And finally, I think it's more important than ever to find ways to enhance food enjoyment without adding sugar, salt, and fat. So I think that the jobs that you all are doing are going to be more important than ever. And I applaud you. I know it's hard. It's going to get harder because we have a changing population. But I think it's important that you listen to the patients and consider, you know, your panelists and your populations, that you be aware of these changes and that you incorporate them into what you're doing. So for additional information, here's some resources, and I'm happy to share these slides with anybody. Here's some resources. This is the smell test that we developed. It's a very rapid smell check. It's 3 lift and sniff. 2 of them have no odor. 1 of them has an odor. You scan this code and brings up some questions. You can do the whole thing in less than 2 minutes, and it's been validated to be as sensitive as the much more lengthy and expensive upsit. So there's a question on which panel has the odor. There's a question on how intense is the odor, and then there's a 4-option odor identification using pictures. So if anybody would like to try this out, shoot me an email. We're happy to send them out to people to test. We are ramping up to have them manufactured on larger scale. Here's one of the papers that describes the test and how it works, if anybody's interested. So I'm gonna end there. Thank you very much for your attention. It's really exciting times, and as I said, I applaud the work that you're doing. I think it's more important than ever before as we try to shift people towards, higher plant-forward diets that probably are going to taste bitter, and you don't just want people to be adding sugar and fat to them. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And that was a very incredible presentation. And I can say probably because of this group that you're presenting to, it almost presented like a horror movie in a way. This could be like the worst case scenario for most of us in our jobs. I'll start out the questions. I actually had a quick one. I recently worked with a customer over a 2-day period. Unfortunately, there was 2 people in attendance, but one of them had this long-term COVID, and it seemed to go in and out between the 2 days. At certain points, that individual was able to taste, and maybe an hour later, there was almost no taste perception. Is that something that you've seen?
It is. It's very challenging from an experimental perspective to try to study that type of situation. But yes, we do hear it from others and people. And it's like you said, it's the worst possible scenario because they think that they're getting better and then they get hit with this and it's gone again. I do think that it is potentially explainable when we think about the biology of the system as the cells are recovering or regenerating. The pattern, and I don't know if this was really odor or taste or both that you're referring to, but the signals that the brain is getting, if more cells regenerate, that can change the pattern so the brain just no longer knows what it is, right? So then it just becomes noise. And so things that the brain considers noise, it just kind of, all right, I'm not going to pay attention to that. And that's where I think sometimes this smell training, it helps the brain to remember and recognize the difference between signal and noise and re-establish those patterns.
We have about 5 more minutes for any questions, so please feel free to ask a question. If not, I actually have another one myself. I was just curious, seeing as this is a non-life-threatening type of injury, let's call it, would there be anybody, do you think, working to help try and remediate those that lost their sense of taste? So some kind of therapy of some sort?
Yes, there are some trials and early stage studies being done with a couple of different techniques. There's for smell, there's a small company that's just been formed using some discoveries from Jim Schwob out of Tufts that is it's a particular growth factor type of compound that can be administered into the nose that seems to help promote repopulation of the stem cell in the nose. So, there haven't been any clinical trials of that in humans yet. It's just getting started, but that's something that, they've shown in animal models does seem to promote recovery. There's work going on here at Monell looking at the role of some of these inflammatory factors, the cytokines, specific cytokines and insulin. And there's certain ones of these factors that also seem to promote regeneration more after the stem cell stage. So it helps the stem cells once they've decided what they're going to be when they grow up. It helps them to get there faster. So that's another approach. And then there's this, people may have heard about plasma-rich protein, protein-rich plasma, PRP, which has been tested. It's kind of an enriched plasma preparation that is administered topically and supposed to help regeneration. Now, I haven't seen any convincing data on that yet. Again, that's a startup company, but I'll be looking for I know there's a couple trials of that going on right now. So I would also encourage people to look at the clinicaltrials.gov to see what's going on and keep tabs if you want to see what how the therapies are coming along.
Very good. Thank you so much, Nancy. I see there's a few questions in the chat. Would you be able to respond through the chat? Okay.
Sure.
Very good. Just to be mindful of time, we'll kind of move on to the next presentation. But wow, this is just very, very eye-opening and very incredible work. And we thank you so much for being heavily involved in that and presenting to our group.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And while we queue up the next presentation, I'd like to introduce John Halligan. John serves as a senior advisor to the Flavor and Extract Manufacturers Association of the United States. And he'll be presenting on the crossroads of creativity and regulations, communicating for flavor development. So really, this is about two different presentations going together. So this will link in very, very closely with Ari and Matt that will be presenting right after him. So would like to introduce John, and if we can, I think we're still trying to upload the presentation.
Hi, everybody. I can share my screen if that'll work.
Thanks, John.
Let me just pull it up here. If I can find it. Okay, it is loading. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. It's asking me if I want to pay. There we go. Can you all see that?
Yeah, I think John, I think I'm sharing at the moment, so
okay.
I'll try and move the slides forward for you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry for that, everybody. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you all today. Really appreciated Nancy's presentation, and my intent today is to share with you some of the information that's available to Fema members and the general public to help you address some of these concerns that Nancy talked about, and also just general resources that are available to help you formulate to your flavors, to be creative, and address some of the regulatory and practical requirements that we all have. So first of all, I want to share a little information with you about Fema. I'm sure you're all aware of what Fema stands for, the Flavor and Extract Manufacturers Association of the United States. And Scott, if we can just move through the slides, I'll just say next slide and we can kind of go from there. Fema was established in 1909, so we've been around for, oh my gosh, 113 years now. A little longer than I've been around. I've been working with Fema for over 40 years now. Yes, I started as a mere child with Fema in the scientific area and then went to law school, and I've met a number of you on the session today. So you're familiar with some of the work that I've done with Fema. And one of Fema's vision is the universal acceptance of the value of flavoring. So we do a lot of work oriented towards public education, working with the general public, but also with the universe of flavor manufacturers and then the users of flavors, the consumer products companies that are the customers for a lot of the flavors that you all create. And I won't go through all the aspects of Fema's strategic plan, but our core values, which I'll spend a little bit of time on, of integrity, sound science, safety, education, and sustainability. And just to emphasize the first value of integrity, Fema has long had an excellent relationship with the Food and Drug Administration, and I will talk about that in a few minutes in the context of the Fema GRAS program. But our relationship with FDA is incredibly important to the success of the flavor industry, especially when we start to talk about the global stage on which we all operate. The Food and Drug Administration, for historical reasons, has had responsibility for flavor safety within the global regulatory framework that's established through the World Health Organization and Food and Agricultural Organization. And the two key pieces there are the Joint Expert Committee for Food Additives, which does the safety assessments for all food ingredients, including flavors, and then the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is responsible for establishing global food standards. And according to the WTO treaties, at some point in the future, when we're all able to be in this more comprehensive and unified regulatory world, we should all have a standard set of global food standards to operate under. Unfortunately, the events of the last couple of days is showing that this big happy world may be a little further in the future than we thought. But anyhow, I think the work of JECFA and Codex will continue. The basis for Fema's integrity is, of course, our scientific program, our Fema GRAS program, which has excellent credibility on the safety issue. So next slide, please. So our 5 goals. And I want to spend a few minutes on this because this is really at the core of the assistance that we can provide to you all as flavorists. So advocacy, education, science, intellectual property protection, and awareness encompass Fema's 5 goals. Next slide, please. So for advocacy, Fema is the leader in the US and also to a certain extent globally on the regulation of flavors. And of course, that starts with flavor safety. For your purposes, in terms of formulating flavors, it's important to have as much information as you need in terms of the safety of the individual flavor ingredients that you're working with to formulate flavors, and then also the regulatory structure that surrounds all this, and that includes not just the safety of the individual flavor ingredients, whether they're chemically defined substances or natural flavoring complexes, but also the labeling requirements for the flavor, compounded flavors that you produce, and then the labeling requirements for the foods that they go into. And we also deal with trade issues, and we've had very important initiatives in workplace safety, most prominently in the manufacture of flavors that are using some of the compounds that have proven to be possible respiratory hazards. And then most recently, of course, during the pandemic, providing assistance to companies in how to deal with safety issues related to COVID-19. So the next slide, please. So for education, we provide a number of opportunities to members in terms of webinars, symposiums, and other educational events to share information on safety, on labeling, workplace safety, and other issues. Most prominently in the last couple of years, we've provided a number of educational opportunities in terms of meetings and webinars related to the labeling of particular aspects of flavor formulation, and then also the presence of flavors in consumer products. Most prominently, we've had very active programs in terms of education on the use and labeling of flavorings with modifying properties. And just here to say a few words about FMPs. This has become a very important area, as you all know, to the flavor industry. And FMPs, under the Codex definitions and FDA's definitions, are in fact considered flavoring substances, even though they do not impart any flavor themselves, but modify the flavor as is perceived by the consumer. And a number of these ingredients are multifunctional. There's a number of stevia derivatives, for example, that and other substances that at higher levels provide a sweetening technical effect, but at lower levels provide only a flavor modifying effect. And this has been a very active area and necessary area for education vis-a-vis compliance with FDA's labeling requirements and global labeling requirements. Next slide, please. Intellectual property protection. Again, I don't need to tell all of you how important that is in terms of protecting your flavor formulas. This is a program that Fema has been active in for many, many years. And while the portfolio of flavor formulas that each of your companies has is proprietary to your company, Fema has championed intellectual property protection on behalf of the industry. And we've also, on occasion, provided advice to individual companies and to Fema members as a whole in terms of how to protect your intellectual property. Next slide, please. So awareness, one of the things that the Fema Board of Governors decided a number of years ago was to work on the consumer side of education and awareness to build a narrative on flavorings in support of key stakeholders, and that includes obviously flavor manufacturers and your customers. So one of the things we've done is created an online presence, and not just limited to the Fema website, but also on some of social media platforms, and paid attention and addressed the increasing incidence of the discussion and awareness of the flavor industry in the general media. So we've been very active in addressing various media outlets in terms of their narrative on flavorings, and corrected things when we've had to in a more aggressive way than we have in the past. Next slide, please. And of course, science really underlies a lot of what Fema does. And of course, the Fema GRASS program is the association's flagship program. And this is the program that assures that all of you as flavor creators have an extensive palette of flavor ingredients that you can use to formulate your compounded flavors. And within that palette, we have things that impart flavor, things that modify flavor. We have flavor adjuvants that are used to allow for the functionality of things imparting or modifying flavor in the finished food, and that includes preservatives, solvents, emulsifiers, and so forth. Fema's long been a leader in the safety evaluation science, and of course, the key aspect of the Fema program here, the key part of the Fema program, is the Fema Expert Panel, which is a group of world-renowned experts that operates independently of Fema to determine the safety of our products. We also have active programs in analytical methods, establishing specifications, And then we've also recently established a check sample program to allow members to determine lab proficiency. Next slide, please. So just to say a few words about GRAS, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is really one of the most important things, if not the most important thing that FEMA does. And this was, the FEMA GRAS program was started in 1959 in response to the Food Additives Amendments to the statute that governs food ingredients in the US. And that allowed for pre-market approval, or required pre-market approval by FDA, but allowed for an exception, which is the generally recognized as safe or GRAS exception. And due to the vision and leadership of a couple people, Dick Hall for one, and Ben Oser for another, the FEMA GRAS program was established for flavors. Next slide, please. So we've been operating since 1959. And again, the FEMA GRAS program will evaluate the safety and provide regulatory authority to use through a GRAS determination to chemically define flavorings. And these are the individual chemical building blocks that all of you use to formulate flavors, things like benzaldehyde, vanillin, acetaldehyde, et cetera. And then also of increasing importance, I'm going to spend just a few more minutes on this, and that's the natural flavoring complexes. And these are your extracts, essential oils, and so forth. Next slide, please. So in 2017, just a few years ago, the expert panel updated its procedure for natural flavoring complexes. And with the increased emphasis recently on natural labeling for consumer products, natural flavoring complexes have become even more prominent in terms of your formulation choices. Next slide, please. So just briefly, having had Dick Hall as a mentor, decision trees and flowcharts are in my DNA, so I had to include one here. So for the evaluation of a natural flavoring complex, this just quickly sketches out what we do at the expert panel, looking at the chemical composition of the natural flavoring complex, because as you all know, the vast majority of them are going to have individual chemical constituents with which we are already familiar, very familiar, and that most likely have FEMA GRAS status. So the expert panel will look at the specifications information. They'll do a call for analytical data if they have to. They'll look at exposure, in other words, food consumption data that for the material itself and the food from which it's derived, and also the food it goes into. And then eventually they will, if it's appropriate, and it is most of the time, reaffirm the GRAS status of the natural flavoring complex, which most likely has been something that's been commonly consumed in food for many, many years. But they take into account the most current toxicological data, and then they'll render a safety evaluation manuscript, which will affirm the GRAS status of these materials. And we published a number of these recently, under the leadership of a couple FEMA staff who I'm sure you're all familiar with, Christy Harmon and Sean Taylor. Next slide, please. So in terms of flavor creation and manufacture, we're FEMA and we're here to help. We have many resources available, and I'm going to list a whole bunch of those in just a few minutes. But one of the most important things that's available to you as a FEMA member, and many of you are FEMA members, is direct assistance from FEMA staff. So if you have a question, myself, Christy Harmon as FEMA's scientific director, Sean Taylor as scientific secretary to the FEMA expert panel, Joanna Drake as FEMA's general counsel, we're all available to deal with you on an individual basis to address your concerns and provide assistance in terms of information you need to be successful in flavor creation and manufacture. Another important thing that's available is FEMA's relationship with other associations, especially Iofi, which is the International Organization of the Flavor Industry. Iofi is an association of associations. FEMA as the US association, JFFMA, the Japanese association, EFA in Europe, ABIFRA in Latin America, and a number of other associations are all members of Iofi. And Iofi is responsible for the EU submissions on flavorings, and again, working towards our goal of global harmonization. but also global outreach when questions come up in various jurisdictions. We've had a lot of work done in South Korea, for example, just to pick one. And then Iofi has a number of information resources which are also available to you as an Iofi member. Next slide, please. So what's on your palate for creating flavor, and what are the resources available to help you with that? The Fema Flavor Ingredient Library is a key resource we established just a few years ago. That's on the publicly available section of the Fema website, and it's publicly available for a key reason, and that is these substances are all GRAS, generally recognized as safe, and a key aspect of GRAS is the general recognition requirement. So we are required by law to make this information all publicly available. So if anyone was to object to something determined to be Fema GRAS, they would be able to do so, and that has very rarely happened. Another list of flavor ingredients that can be on your palate is the Iofi Global Reference List. And this is available to you as a Fema member. You can access it on the Iofi website. And again, this is intended to provide a list of flavor ingredients that's available on a global basis. And it lets you know where they're available and the circumstances under which they're available. And then one thing that we always encourage formulators to do, and your customers, is to, when you're developing a flavor, think about what the labeling conclusion is going to be for your customer's product. In other words, think about, at least as part of your analysis, starting at the end, what's the labeling conclusion that you want? Do you want it to be able to use the generic label declaration as permitted at 21 CFR 10122? Those are the FDA food and flavor labeling regulations to declare flavors naturally or as natural flavor or artificial flavor. How do you want to label your bulk flavor container going to your customer? These are all very important considerations which will determine, in part at least, the success of your flavor formulation. And just a word about the food and flavor labeling regulations. We've got a number of publications on this. Joanna Drake and I just published one recently, which is a couple years ago, which is intended to address labeling considerations for flavors and foods containing FMPs. But these labeling regulations are very old. They're over 50 years old. They've basically never been updated. So when you look at them, for instance, the definition of natural flavor, 10122A3, you'll see that it is the same definition as, the industry's worked with for over 60 years. It's never been updated. And one of the key aspects in which it has not been updated is new methods of manufacture. And these are methods such as fermentation using genetically modified organisms, for example. That's not accounted for. There's been litigation on that, and FDA has declined to really do anything about it because what they've told us is it's not a safety issue, so you guys go figure it out, which is a pretty unfair position to put the industry in. But that's where we are. So just keep that in mind as you look at those regulations, and we are available to help you navigate these very complicated and antiquated regulations. Next slide, please. So let's talk about specifically some member resources that are available to you that can be helpful in your work in formulating flavors. The Fema website, for one, there's a wealth of information on there. We've been in the process these last couple of months of updating and upgrading it. So I think our goal is to make it even more user-friendly and to include even more extensive information than we have on there now. The Flavor Ingredient Library, again, is a really positive and extensive improvement that we've made in the website. It's searchable. You can look for any ingredient you want to and find out whether it's Fema GRAS and immediately pull off a whole bunch of very useful information on it. Next slide, please. So let's get specific about some resources, and I've given the direct links here to these sections on the Fema website. First of all, the section on Fema GRAS, which gets at the most important issue of all, and that's the safety of the materials that you can use to formulate flavors. And a lot of that information is available in the Flavor Ingredient Library. Another very important section is the section on food categories and use levels. And again, this is a legal requirement for GRAS, and that is that a substance is only GRAS for the use for which it has been determined to be safe. So something that is GRAS for flavor use is not GRAS necessarily for anything else other than flavor use. So it's very key to see the food categories and use levels which constitute the conditions of intended use for a Fema GRAS substance. And again, this is absolutely key to your work because if you get outside of these food categories and use levels, there may not be regulatory authority to use the individual substance, whether it's a chemically defined substance or a natural flavoring complex that you want to use to formulate that flavor. Next slide, please. Another very useful information resource on the Fema website is the Fema GRAS country acceptance list. This will let you know, excuse me, which countries accept Fema GRAS. There are a number of countries that accept Fema GRAS, but it's not explicitly written into their their national statutory law. But this list can help you navigate that issue in terms of looking for the flavor formulation that you're putting together, in terms of which countries you won't have any concerns about regulatory authority to use. So again, a very useful compilation, which we do our best to keep up to date. I mentioned this earlier, but one of the key issues that we've been spending so much time on lately is flavorings with modifying properties. And we have a update on that on the Fema website, which talks about how to label the flavor that you produce, and then also your customers' products that may contain a flavor formulation that contains an FMP. Again, this has become a very important area to the flavor industry and to the customer community as we look at producing foods that are considered by consumers to be healthier or that have a certain taste profile. So again, FMPs are a very important area for the industry and for the customer community. And we've got a variety of information resources available on that, including a pretty extensive paper, as I mentioned earlier, that Joanne and I published a couple of years ago. Another example of a resource on the Fema website is the information document that we just put out on chlorpyrifos. This is an example of how we address current issues. As many of you know, EPA revoked the tolerance for chlorpyrifos last year. EPA is responsible for the efficacy and safety of pesticides, and FDA is responsible for the appearance of residues, so to speak, of EPA-approved pesticides in food. So FDA, under the regulatory construct, had until the end of this month, in fact, to put out their guidance document on chlorpyrifos, which is out, and that's available on the Fema website at this site. And this is important because we've been aware that there's various pesticide residues present in natural flavoring complexes. We've been aware of this for some time. Many of them are covered by tolerance. And when a tolerance is revoked, it becomes very important because that food that contains a pesticide for which a tolerance has been revoked can be considered adulterated in this brand under the statute and could be subject to recall. There's been instances where that has not happened, and there's been some where it has. But FDA generally addresses this issue pretty promptly, which they've done here, and that information is available on the Fema website. Next slide, please. Almost done. I'm almost at the end of my time, so I'll finish up quickly. We've got some additional member resources, which I think you'll find very useful as well. Fema conducts a poundage survey at 5-year intervals. And this is very interesting data to look at because it shows trends in flavor use. It gives you the volumes that have been reported over various periods of time. We do each survey in 5-year intervals, but you can look backwards as well, and you can look at trends from a retrospective perspective and perhaps predict from a prospective perspective. We've got a ton of publications on safety and GRAS status. Many of these are available on the website. If you can think of one in particular that you're having a hard time finding, just contact us, contact me, we'll get it to you. Publications on labeling, and of course, publications on workplace safety. Next slide, please. There's also a number of resources available from Fema's association with other groups, and I'd already mentioned Iofi, the International Organization of the Flavor Industry. The Global Reference List is a key resource which allows you, again, to look at, as I mentioned earlier, the palette of flavor ingredients that are available. They also have a regulatory database and a code of practice. And one resource not to be forgotten is the very extensive resource that was developed jointly by the flavor side and fragrance side of your businesses, and that's the RIFM, that stands for Research Institute for Fragrance Materials, and Iofi database. This database is extensive in terms of safety information, environmental information, and so forth on individual flavor fragrance ingredients, and that is available for subscription if you're a member of Fema or a member of Iofi. And it's just an extensive, wonderful resource that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to take a look at that. If you're a FEMA member, that's available, again, on a subscription basis through RIFM. And we can help you with that process if you need any help with that. My next slide, which is my last one. So the message I want to leave you with is we have many, many resources that are available to assist you in flavor creation and manufacture. Please feel free to contact us on a staff basis, an individual staff basis, to provide assistance. We've got a number of materials on the website. There's the Iofi and RIFM resources, and we've got tons of publications out there. So thank you very much for your attention. Scott, if we've got time for questions, I can take them now or later, but really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you and share information on Fema and what we have available to help you as flavorists.
Thanks, John, and definitely appreciate everything you've done for the industry and just the community as a whole. I was hoping you might stay on and join Ari and Matt for this Q&A session as an extra set of ears.
Absolutely, happy to.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So we'll roll right into the open forum, and how it's going to work is we have some questions that have already been collected from people submitting. And so we'll go into one or two of those. And if you have a question, please just type into the chat question so that we can get to you in order of the question coming in. If we have to raise the hand thing, it would probably, I'd probably miss over people. So it'd be just better to go through the chat. So really quickly, just to introduce, we have Ari Gassman, Principal Flavorist and Global Citrus at Firmenich. And we have Matt Bainbrick, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Döhler North America. And I did want to just mention one other thing. We do want to help answer all the questions, but if there are any that kind of conflict with their various company policies, they might have to be a little bit vague about their answers. So just to kind of preface that. So just to jump into one of the first questions that we had, and this will be a little bit of a softball to get us started. What recent TTB changes have occurred in washed citrus extracts?
That's really a softball, Scott. Thanks for having me and Matt here. I'm happy to be participating and following these two fantastic presentations. Matt, I assume you're going to want me to take that one. So
yeah, I think I'll let you take this one, Ari.
So the TTB a few years back, we're not exactly sure exactly when, had changed their guideline for washed extracts to include 6.33%. Well, 6.33% of starting oil. However, they had what had happened a few years back was that they added an annotation that indicated that it had to be a derivation of a single oil, not combined oils. However, people have been doing this for a long time might remember that it's common to blend citrus oils, and to now have a washed extract comprised of just a single oil at that level could be somewhat limiting to development. And so it's great to have John on board here through some wonderful work at Fema and the volunteers. And I see Colleen's on the line as well. She helped lead this working group. We were able to show TTB published data that indicated blending the oils at for a total of 6.33% versus an individual oil is really providing the same amount of constituents, which is what's denaturing the product. So that's the change that took place. TTB did revert back, and now it's changed that annotation to indicate that a blend of oils totaling 6.33% is permissible.
Thanks, Ari. So we'll move on to another question that's been received prior to this. If I have a natural flavor WNF, how much flavoring strength should be derived from the characterizing flavors? The United States regulations are not clear on this. So if I have a natural mango flavored WNF, I find it misleading to only add a drop of mango essence and call it mango.
Well, again, I'll take this one, Ari, and maybe we'll tap John in on this one too, because I think it goes back quite a ways here from an industry practice and from a company-specific type of policy, right? I mean, because it is written as vague as it is in the CFR, it gives different flavoring companies the opportunity to create their own policies around how much of the named source needs to be present. I know a lot of the customers will drive that decision as well because they'll have their own internal levels that need to be met, right? I think to that end, it's difficult to put a hard and fast number on it. I think it's kind of to go back to what Nancy Higley and I used to always joke around about was to cross your heart and thou shalt not deceive the consumer, right? So does it pass the sniff test, no pun intended, to be able to stand in front of a group of your peers and not get laughed out of the room?
Yeah, this one, as Matt's saying, this goes back a long, long way. And there's been, the question was posed about what we used to call the one drop theory. That has been employed, I'm aware, from time to time. But the other side of that is there should be enough of the named flavor to characterize the warmth as, for example, a mango WONF. That should have enough mango in it to characterize it as mango. Now, this has never really been put before FDA in any sort of a meaningful way. And the characterizing concept is one that was a really novel idea back in the late 60s and early 70s when those regulations were put together. As I mentioned in my talk, these regulations have been around over 50 years now. And the principles there are not with us anymore, either retired or have passed away. So it's kind of hard to really get at the intent, although I did get a call from Peter Hutt a couple years ago, 2 years ago, who was working on another edition of his food and drug law treatise, which is used in all the law schools to teach food and drug law. And Peter was delving into this issue of the characterizing concept, WONFs and so forth. And he has not published that version yet, so I'm really not sure where he's going to come out on it, but that'll be something we'll keep an eye on. But I think Matt's just summarized it. I mean, it's done on an individual basis, a relationship with customers. you've got the one drop theory, then you've got the characterizing concept as well that all kind of fits together.
You know, if I might build on what John said, I mean, I think some of the changes we've seen from the CFIA up in Canada, right, with their current natural flavor labeling regulations and what they're pushing forward is there is a bit of a more concrete level that they've put in place where they're now telling you that, you know, 51% of the characterizing flavor must come from the name source. Right now, they'll tell you also it's in the same breath that 51% of the strength has to come from the same characterizing flavor. So, I mean, they've left it a little bit nebulous too, but it has given it a little bit more of a concrete number to put on it as we look to other countries and their regulations throughout the world.
Yeah, and what Matt's saying is really important because, you know, I think we would all, a lot of us would like to have some sort of a numerical construct at 50, whether it's 51% or whatever. The characterizing concept, as Matt's pointing out, gives you more latitude because do you need 51% of mango in a mango WONF to make it taste like mango, or what is it? And there's still even there quite a bit of latitude for subjectivity.
And John, I think that comment there is actually a really good segue into something I'd like to share on this, is that for those, I think a big part of the reason why we wanted to have this panel is to understand how flavorists and regulatory departments can work together. And so under that context, it's definitely a conversation that whomever submitted that question should be having with their regulatory department, especially at the project onset. And furthermore, I know there's all types of backgrounds on the line, from large companies to very small. If you happen to work for a company that doesn't have a guideline behind this, in the lack of context from the FDA, it is something that can be done via taste tests. In other words, as John's saying, do you really need 51% mango content in a mango WNF? Flavors can be split apart into components where you're adding or taking away the FTNF mango portion or adding or taking away the WONF portion to understand what's characterizing or providing impact on the taste.
Yeah, and Ari's
I think Ari.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say that this whole issue of sensory testing has become very prominent in the area of FMPs, but also is equally prominent in this area. And we've got a couple papers out there, you know, that deal with sensory testing. And those of you who would like assistance on sensory testing, Christy Harmon would be the person at Fema for you to get in touch with. Christy has really mastered this subject and is just excellent in terms of giving an overview as to how to approach sensory testing.
I think that's brilliant, John. You know, and it ties in with what Ari mentioned about, you know, kind of the genesis of this Q&A panel type situation, where it was how does flavor creation and regulatory work together to meet the business's needs and the objectives in challenging times or in changing times. But I mean, I think it goes into how do all of the functions, kind of all of the technical functions work together, which includes sensory, right? And it's coming to the table with those ideas and working together to find a way forward.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. And that's clearly what we've seen, again, using FMPs as a surrogate here, because you start out with safety and looking at what is this stuff, and then you move into sensory in terms of verifying, in terms of GRAS status, the technical effect, or in other words, the conditions of intended use of the material. And safety, frankly, is usually not a question with a lot of the FMPs that we're dealing with. Their stevia derivatives. But the question then becomes, how is it functioning in terms of the conditions of intended use to meet the requirements for GRAS? And then how are you going to label the products down the line? Both the label you put on your package when it goes to a customer and how the customer is going to label their food.
Thank you. I see we have three very passionate people here, and that's always exciting. We'll take one from the chat, and this is for all three of you. It says, John mentioned updating methods of modern technologies have not been reviewed for approximately 60 years. An example mentioned was GMO. What other modern technologies would you speculate may also be points of contention for natural labeling?
Well, I can just say a couple words about that. I mean, the big one, again, is fermentation techniques that are using genetically modified organisms. And this came up in some of the litigation. As you're probably all aware, there's been an increasing amount of litigation recently in the absence of FDA making certain policy decisions and policy statements. We've got one particularly active attorney in this area, a guy named Spencer Sheehan. I see some smiles. People know Spencer. He's been active in the vanilla area and is branching out now into natural claims and other things. And there's been some other litigation dealing with not just vanilla, but also this issue of what constitutes a natural flavor. And there were some cases in federal courts in recent years where the judges actually got together and wrote to FDA, and I've got the letters if any of you want them, requesting that FDA provide guidance to the courts as they try to resolve this issue of what is natural, both from a food basis and then the flavor in it. And FDA wrote back this letter and said, no, we're not going to do it. You know, we are concerned with safety, and we're not really concerned. We do have labeling regulations, but they provided a quote from a 1990, I think it was from the NLEA preambles, which was not particularly helpful to the judges. So, but that's one of the technologies that's not accounted for. We get questions on CO2 supercritical extraction and other manufacturing methods that can be used to produce, you know, chemically defined flavoring substances, and also extraction of natural flavoring complexes from source materials. So there's a variety of things that are just not covered. Now, some companies will argue that I got a call the other day from a company that said, but John, it says fermentation right in 10122A3. And you know, the next question is, well, what organism are you using, and is it genetically modified? And then, you know, you go through the risk calculation because FDA has said they're not going to be active in enforcement in this area, and then companies make their decision as to how they want to handle it. So there's, yeah, a variety of things that are not accounted for there. That's just a couple of the major ones.
All right, hopefully this one will be a little bit easier. Should we disclose acetaldehyde on our Prop 65 statement if it's being added to flavors?
I mean, I don't know, John, I know Prop 65 is near and dear to your heart, so, but I'll go ahead and take this one. I mean, acetaldehyde is listed as Prop 65 substance. If you are formulating and you have acetaldehyde in your formulation, you should be disclosing to your customer.
Yeah, and I thought whoever asked that question said that was an easy question. You know, because I still get the inquiry about the acetaldehyde listing, and does it only apply to inhalation exposure or also to ingestion exposure and so on and so forth. And I managed to dig up some correspondence, which goes back, you know, that's to 1989, maybe. Prop 65 came in 86. And, you know, I think Matt's answer is the right answer. Yeah.
Okay, the next question comes from the chat. For those who are newer to the industry or newer to the world of TTB, where would you suggest they go to educate themselves or find resources on formulation guidelines, regulatory requirements, and tools?
The TTB has something called the TTB tutorial that's posted on their website. That's a great resource. It's kind of a guideline of how they expect formula submissions to be made and can help guide the flavorist. There's also a number of Fema resources. There have been a number of presentations and workshops given that that demonstrate some of this. Some of them have even been recorded, and if you're a Fema member, you can access that in the archives. And again, the Fema context that John mentioned earlier actually can help answer the questions directly and or get it to a subject matter expert that can.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ari, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. But I mean, it's almost another shameless plug for FEMA and the ATTC committee, right? I mean, I think back to when I joined the industry and I first started working with the TTB, and your head can easily be spinning when you first start working in those circles. But I mean, getting involved with the industry associations and working your way through the TTB tutorial, and to Ari's point, you know, making connections within your organization, outside of your organization, with people that you're comfortable with to bounce ideas off of each other. You know, when you get stuck on a submission, those are really kind of the way forward there, from my opinion.
And going back, I agree, Matt. And going back to the collaboration between regulatory and creation or development, whatever your individual organization calls it, it's a good time to get them involved up front. You don't develop a flavor, submit it to them and say it's 2TB approvable, and then get mad when they say no, because unfortunately that's only putting that regulatory scientist in the position of being a police person. If you go in and have a conversation and explain what your intent may be, how you're thinking about going about this, is there anything based on that that you feel is a good way to follow, or something that you should look out for? For example, there was a question about washed extracts earlier. If you know that your application or the project you're working on is going to require washed extract, your regulatory professional will then be able to guide you on what's required there. And or who knows, if you're making a raspberry flavor, you might not even realize that acetic acid is a limited ingredient, and you're obviously going to use that in your formula. There's a lot of things you can learn just by talking to people, and given that the context is set for those who are newer in the industry, it's important to know that these resources and materials have not been available for a long time. When I started in the industry, there was no tutorial. There was papers, if you were lucky to have them and read them. I learned a lot at the time just by calling TTB directly. They don't encourage that so much anymore, so I'm not going to, but they can also be a resource.
Well, thank you. We have another question, which I think really speaks to the topic at hand. It's about collaboration, right? So what changes in flavor regulations have prompted creative solutions? And I think we can describe this from both sides of the fence, the flavor creation side and from the regulatory side.
I don't know, Ari, you want to take it off and then we go from there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for this side, I am sitting up here with a bunch of regulatory folks, but I am a flavorist, so I'll speak to it from the creation perspective. I think that certainly specific TTB guidelines have offered creative solutions. In other words, when the washed extract guideline was pushed to a single source oil, I'm sure that many of you figured out a way to combine multiple washes, or I'm not going to give away my tricks here, but in addition, I would say some of the organic regulations have likely prompted that. Same with the non-GMO project. I think each of these, pretty much any requirement that has put a constraint on what's allowed or able or limited in the flavor yields itself to creative solutions.
I think you're dead right, Ari. And I mean, I think two of them that I can come up with off the top of my head, right, are the USDA and the BE labeling that came into effect early this year. And then, I mean, we've known about it for a couple of years, but now we're kind of paying the piper after kicking that can down the road. And I think organic is always an ever-changing landscape, right? And I think it's an easy one to kind of take a look at and say, hey, this is where the two functions, and even multiple functions. I mean, even your procurement functions are going to have to get involved in this stuff You know, let's say Ari develops a flavor and he comes to me and says, hey, I need to get this organic certified. We go through it, and there's a few items in there that might be agricultural or have agricultural pieces to them. And depending on who your organic certifier is, unfortunately, some of them will approve it as is. Some of them will make you prove commercial unavailability. Some of them might even go down the road of going into the organic database themselves and saying, oh, well, I see this one customer that produces this one product as an organic item, and they'll say, you know, commercial availability be damned, for lack of a better term, right? I mean, we see it's out there, you need to buy from them. So it's being able to have those conversations with flavor creation, with regulatory, and say, hey, all right, this is what our organic guys are telling us. This is something that I've seen work in the past, or have you thought about this, or could we tweak this and drop the percentage of it, raise this over here? You know, it's an iterative, collaborative process to get through these changes. You know, I mean, and if I go back to the bioengineered labeling piece, I think, and John touched on it as well with some of the newer technology that's used to create flavors. You know, how can we work through it and find a way to, you know, ensure that we are keeping our own companies on the up and up and in the right space, but also B, being able to ensure that our customers at the end of the day are taken care of and won't have challenges when they go to market as well.
Thanks, Matt. We'll move on to another question from the chat, and I'm going to assume that it's related to the WNF question before, but Rodney, please jump in if I'm incorrect. So the question is, in general, in terms of various flavor companies' use for their products, in terms of the percentage of essential oil added to make that given flavor, is that a lot? So I'm assuming this is related to the WNF question from before. Is that correct, Rodney? Yep.
Can you repeat the last part of that, Scott? Sorry.
I guess it's the percentage of essential oil. I think it's to the 51%. You know, in general, is that considered to be a lot, or?
I mean, from my perspective, I would say that, you know, when you're developing a flavor, as we were talking about with, you know, strength of flavor and being able to characterize it, it really depends on the strength of the oil that you're using, right? And what the actual taste implications are of that material. I mean, you can have 51% of a 1X orange oil, but if you have 51% of a 10X orange oil, you know, it's going to be through the roof. So it really goes back to what's the material that you're using and how's it interacting within your application.
Yeah, and to further complicate matters, you can think about an issue that came up back in the 1980s with bitter almond oil and benzaldehyde content in bitter almond oil. I don't know how many of you remember this, but you know, that was a big deal back during the quote unquote natural benzaldehyde issue in the 1980s, and really brought about the formation of the cooperative program Fema had with the University of Georgia and the Center for Applied Isotope Studies, looking at the quote unquote naturalness of bitter almond oil that was being put on the market at the time. So if you had a bitter almond oil that was claimed to be whatever percentage of benzaldehyde, that would obviously influence how much of that bitter almond oil you would put into your WONF to try, if you were operating under the characterizing concept as to how much was characterizing. And then the whole controversy back then became, well, is that really legitimate, quote unquote, natural bitter almond oil containing quote unquote natural benzaldehyde? And some of you may remember all the gory details of that with the individual that was trying to corner the market for bitter almond pits and cherry pits and all the rest of it. So piece of ancient history. I think I see Mike Bloom smiling there because Mike remembers it. Again, yeah, that's a great question, but it's a complicated one. It's got the aspects that Matt mentioned, but also the aspect of what is the individual chemical, for example, that is characterizing in that natural flavoring complex. Vanillin for vanilla extract, for example, or benzaldehyde for bitter almond oil.
You bring up great point, John, and shame on me. We should have brought it up earlier when we were talking about this. But I mean, even when you get into the natural complex substances, right? Bitter almond oil is a perfect example. You extract something, or you take the oil out of something, but then you concentrate to the point where essentially you've got a single chemically defined substance. And then is it a bitter almond oil, or is it the single chemically defined substance? And that's where, again, I mean, I think Ari and I have lived this one before together. Even that, it's how are you going to label it, and where's it going to fall? So yeah.
All right.
Do you wish there were simpler answers to a lot of these questions?
We warned you, Scott, that there was going to be some dancing around that was done here. So
I feel like I'm asking really challenging questions here. And the next one, I apologize in advance for, because I feel like we could use about 2 more hours to answer this one. But what challenges appear when developing a flavor that needs to be compliant on a global scale, and what collaborations could facilitate success?
Wow.
I mean,
go ahead, Matt.
That's a good one, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, if I boil it down to putting one phrase answer together for that, I would say that it's nearly impossible to have one flavor developed that's compliant in every country across the world. I think, as John alluded to in his presentation prior, you've got conditions of intended use to keep in mind, and we do have Iofi, and we do hope that one day there is a global reference list that is indeed global, but I think we're still a ways off from that, right? I mean, if I look at, I think one of my favorite items to pick on in this instance is, it's not so much anymore, but prior to one of the more recent GRAS publications, hibiscus extract from H. sabdarifera, right? It was approved as color in the U.S. It was approved as, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was flavor in Japan, but then Codex would only allow you to use it in jams, and then Latin America it was flavor all over the place, and then Europe was kind of a mixed bag. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind is, once you pick the technical effect of the material that you're using within like let's just say it's for the U.S., right? You've picked your technical effect, and you're telling me that as the regulatory guy, or Ari comes to me and says, yep, I'm going to use this, and I'm using it for flavor. So that's your technical effect. So let me say, if it's only approved as color in another country, you can't, just because you cross a land border or a political border or a country border, it doesn't change the technical effect of the material that you're using, right? So I mean, I think that's one of the biggest challenges with regards to globally formulating one flavor. I mean, I think we all know some of the biggest brands in the world, they've got 30, 40 different formulas for their brand name products. So I mean, I think it's a tough ask, and it's one that we're all asked to do quite often. But I mean, I think as you work together with your flavor creation folks, you find a way to ensure that what you're developing is, let's say, for example, you're doing a compliance check for 208 countries, and you get maybe 197 of them, and then that's where you go back to your customer and you have that conversation. You say, look, from a flavor development standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, this is where we're at today. But if we change, and give you another SKU, you can then be compliant across the board with different products. I don't know, Ari, if you have anything else to add, or John.
Yeah, to build on what you're saying, Matt, I mean, the hibiscus example is a good one, and that's just one, right?
Yeah.
So I think what really supports your statement of impossibility is the discrepancies between so many different countries, and that's just one example. There's dozens, if not hundreds. And I think to be specific on how to develop for that, And I don't mean to be beating the same drum over and over, but that's another, usually the more complex the request, the more that should be discussed up front with both the client and internal stakeholders. And so, you know, learning up front from the regulatory scientists, excuse me, what can be grouped together, or you know, what regions, some regions have similar requirements, and so you may be able to start with a core formula from a taste perspective, and then split it so that one fits the region A versus region B versus region C. And it could be tricky because a lot of these checks are so complex that they're automated and computerized, and you might just have to start with some trial and error up front.
No, but I think you hit on it, and I should have carried the mantra forward. And what I was saying, Ari, is get together up front. You know, get the teams together. It may not be that you're there for all the project approvals, but I mean, as soon as, you know, maybe you as a flavorist get a project to work on, and you see that there may be some challenges down the road, go to your regulatory team, sit down with them. We're not all scary people, contrary to popular belief. And, you know, some of us can actually carry a conversation too. So, I mean, I think it's really forming those partnerships and working together to really, you know, be able to position yourself and your organizations for success.
Well, I see that we're at time, and I am not necessarily surprised by the amount of questions we've got, but we definitely have more questions kind of sitting. But because we're at time, I guess we'll kind of end it there. But geez, this is just great to hear from Ari and Matt, and thanks, John, for kind of hanging on the line and providing input. Just really fascinating stuff, and even kind of diving into the history of some of this is really incredible as well. Chris, do you have anything you'd like to kind of say as we kind of close out?
No, not really, except great presentations, wealth of information. Thank you very much, everyone. It was great. And we can go ahead and kick off our business side of the meeting here in a couple minutes. And all I need is, if you are not a member, to please disconnect, log off.
Everybody.
And,
Yeah.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Nancy.
Have a great afternoon.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you.
thanks again.